Not too long ago, I got an interesting email. It was an invitation to participate in a slightly unusual clinical trial. The trial was testing the effects of a novel potential treatment for depression, a substance called N,N-dimethyltryptamine, and you might have heard of it under a different name. DMT. It's one of the active compounds in ayahuasca, a traditional South American psychedelic beverage, and it's widely seen as one of the most potent hallucinogenics on the planet. And it wasn't the only study like this taking place. In fact, over the last few years, there's been a number of studies looking into using psychedelics as treatments for things like depression, anxiety, bipolar syndrome, and addiction. But when we peel back the curtain, we see that there's actually a much more interesting story at play here. Not just one about drugs, but rather one about politics, the public representation of science, and the very real barriers that a novel discovery has to overcome in order to ever achieve the promises it might seem to make at first. Okay, but how did we even get here in the first place? How did we go from something that would land you in jail to something that's being marketed as the hottest new thing in psychotherapy? Well, the truth is, the therapeutic uses of psychedelics have been somewhat of an open secret for a really long time. There's evidence suggesting that people might have been aware of psychedelics going back as far as 9,000 years ago, and even more modern preparations have been in use for at least 1,000 years. But it wasn't until far more recently that these substances started to enter the mainstream scientific literature. A particularly important turning point took place in Basel, Switzerland in 1938, specifically at this lab right here. This lab belonged to Sandoz Pharmaceuticals, which today makes up one of the biggest pharmaceutical companies on the planet. And back in 1938, Dr. Albert Hofmann, a Swiss chemist, synthesized a new compound while working there. Lysergic acid, better known as LSD. And a few years later, he decided to secretly test it on himself, and had a pretty remarkable experience. He describes perceiving an uninterrupted stream of fantastic pictures, extraordinary shapes with an intense kaleidoscopic play of colours. But he also experienced some delusions. For example, he described his friendly neighbour transforming into a malevolent, insidious witch. Albert Hofmann clearly had a way with words, and after this pretty wild experience, his employer, Sandoz Pharmaceuticals, began to run trials with the substance. And the English-speaking world began a short-lived love affair with psychedelics. At the time, nobody was entirely sure what these drugs could be used for. They were widely believed for a while to be psychotomimetics, basically a drug that could simulate the effects of particular mental illnesses. But some psychiatrists found that taking the drug didn't necessarily reliably produce negative effects, and the experience was sometimes fairly pleasurable. LSD in particular also showed promise in treating alcoholism, outperforming every other known treatment at the time. In fact, things looked really promising. Well, until this.
America's public enemy number one is drug abuse. In order to fight and defeat this enemy, it is necessary to wage a new all-out offensive.
Psychedelics weren't just promising medically, they were also a big part of the anti-war movement and of the general counterculture of the time. This, paired with the fact that the CIA had ran some failed experiments to use it as a mind control agent, the fact that 1 in 5 Vietnam War veterans returned with some kind of opiate addiction, and Nixon's general view of drugs as being a social rot on America, led to psychedelics falling by the wayside. It affected far more than just the public perception though. At this point in time, around 70% of scientific research was funded by the state, and so the money dried up, and even Sandoz, who had created this molecule, stopped its production. With the introduction of the Controlled Substances Act, LSD became a Schedule I drug. That is, a drug that is deemed to have no medical use. And if we look at the amount of research that was published on psychedelics after the Controlled Substances Act, you can see a pretty sharp drop-off. Psychedelics fell off the map and stayed off in favour of other drugs that were less contentious and also deemed to be safer at the time. It wasn't until a good 2 decades later that things began to change. In no small part thanks to the National Institute on Drug Abuse, a government agency which focused on tackling drug abuse via treatment rather than punishment, and was able to eventually convinced the leadership at the Food and Drug Administration to treat hallucinogens no differently than any other drug. But also due to some particularly brave scientists, such as Dr. Rick Strassman, who was able to push through a study on a less well-known hallucinogen, DMT. And ever since that study, as well as another few landmark papers, there's been a second wave of psychedelics that spawned not only research, but also documentaries, news articles, and even some relatively important policy change. For example, psilocybin, the active compound in magic mushrooms, is now deemed a breakthrough therapy, making it easier for trials to gain approval in the US. And that brings us more or less up to today. And from what it sounds like, we're all good, right? We're just a few steps away from having this cure-all treatment that should fix everyone's mental health issues. Well, unfortunately, that's not quite where we are. Even though this is a really promising narrative, this is one of the cases where the desire to tell an interesting story can sometimes get in the way of the desire to tell an accurate one. The idea that hallucinogens are a perfect solution that have been stifled for purely political reasons is somewhat of an incomplete assessment. For example, Dr. Sidney Cohen, a person who was pretty instrumental in LSD eventually becoming a Schedule I drug, was a person who'd actually conducted some pretty significant research into it as a medical treatment, and without a doubt had a far better understanding of it than the vast majority of people do. He was well aware of LSD's upsides, and at one point even argued that it should be considered a potential medical treatment, but became concerned when he saw it being distributed unscrupulously, and believed that it carried genuine risks because of this. But at the same time, he argued that there was no pharmacological quality in marijuana that would lead to it causing more crime. And so if we just take a second to zoom out and take a bird's eye view of the situation here, you can see that this is a case that happens time and time again. A case where scientists, media, and politics don't entirely align in the kind of message that they wish to promote. And so I think the best way to get a clearer state of where this research is today is to ask ourselves, what do the scientists think? And when we ask that question, we get a picture that is better described, I think, as being cautiously optimistic. A particularly good example of this cautious optimism is the following opinion piece by two British scientists, one of which is a psychiatrist at the Centre for Psychedelic Research in London. They raise a few issues that anyone should really be aware of before preaching psychedelics as being a proven medical cure. For example, they raise the fact that psychedelics run into a few issues that really are foundational to modern drug testing. In many drug trials, we want to make sure that we're detecting effects that are actually present, not just ones that we want to find. And a simple way to do this is through blinding a trial, giving some patients a placebo, a dummy version of the drug, and some people a legitimate version. However, with psychedelics, there's a pretty obvious problems in that the effects are so potent that it's usually quite easy to tell if you've received a placebo or if you've received the real thing. It can be an even bigger problem afterwards when the patient is expected to go to multiple therapy sessions to discuss their experience. And there are ways to mitigate this effect, for example by using what's called an active placebo, which can simulate at least part of the effects of a psychedelic drug. However, they aren't that much more effective. These studies have a tendency to also self-select pretty aggressively for people who are typically more optimistic about hallucinogens, as well as for people who can pass a remarkably rigorous screening procedure. And when we consider all of these things, it might end up looking like the results that we have aren't necessarily as reliable as you might think. The populations in which some of these early studies are being conducted aren't entirely reflective of the populations which need the most help. As we expand these trials to more diverse groups of people, it's only natural that we'll start to see more negative side effects crop up that we hadn't seen before. And some of these so-called rocky landings might only show up weeks or months after the completion of a trial. And although compounds like LSD and psilocybin are not known to have any lethal dose, they are far more likely to have negative side effects when people use them to self-medicate. But that doesn't mean that the hype is a completely bad thing, because if the opioid crisis has shown anything, It's that marketing is arguably just as important as efficacy when it comes to getting a treatment to market. All of this hype doesn't just result in news articles and documentaries, it results in actual funding and in real scientists being able to do real work. Work that wouldn't take place otherwise. Psychedelics are in a bit of a bubble right now, as any new technology goes through. Promising results lead to hype, some funding, and some of the issues being brushed under the rug for the public-facing angle, at least. And to be fair, some of the issues they face aren't entirely to do with the drugs themselves, but partially just to do with the system in which they exist. One that is especially rigorous, which is a good thing, but also one that is fundamentally driven by profit. And so until psychedelic treatments can be delivered safely, ethically, and profitably, it's unlikely that this revolution in psychedelic literature will actually translate to a revolution in patients, many of whom really need treatment, actually ever receiving it.
Hi loves, just want to say thank you to Tam, Justin, Daniel, Alfie, Stephen, Blueberry, Sarah, Khan, Chris and Michael for supporting me on Patreon. Really helps a ton. Thank you so much. Bye bye.